Now, in the 1920s, the Nazis aren't that popular. They're very notorious. They go out in the street and they would fight, and they would, especially the stormtroopers, the SA, uh, they would cause fights. They were very, very violent. And they didn't gain a lot of traction. But what changed for the Nazis and really helped bring them to power, played a central role in bringing the Nazis to power, was the Great Depression of the 1930s, where the world economy was plunged um, into a horrible economic downturn. Like in the United States, one out of every four workers was unemployed. Well, Germany was affected by the Great Depression as well. And suddenly, what you have is this social dislocation in Germany, combined with still the anger about World War I, the stab in the back thesis, simmering anti-Semitism. Um, Hitler would give speeches where he would talk about how Jews controlled banks and that kind of a thing. It's interesting. Sometimes I give these lectures. The last time I did this course, I gave a lecture, and Google wouldn't let me print it or wouldn't let me post it because it sounded anti-Semitic. And of course, just what I was doing was explaining the Nazi thought. So I guess it's the times that we live in. I mean, I'm glad Google is keeping, I guess it's YouTube, but doesn't Google own YouTube? I'm glad they're keeping kind of an eye on this. I don't think they keep a very close eye on things, honestly. But anyway, so just to cut to the chase, by 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in the Reichstag, the German parliament. And this was Hitler's game plan. His game plan was not an overthrow of the German government. His game plan and the game plan of the Nazis was to gain control over the democratic apparatuses or apparati in Germany, and then to chip away at individual rights. In 1932, the Nazis have gained significant power in Germany because of the dislocations of the Great Depression. Hitler's talk about the Volk, his talk about the German people, the master race, his constant harping on the horrors of the Versailles Treaty, have gained new resonance among the German people. And he's appointed the Chancellor of Germany. That's not the equivalent of being the President of the United States, because the Chancellor oversees the German Parliament. But nonetheless, it's a very significant and very powerful position. And once he gains this position, he starts chipping away at individual rights. And the key thing that happens is that there's a fire that breaks out in the Reichstag building in Berlin. And authorities arrest a young communist who happened to be Dutch, and he confessed to starting it. And for Hitler, this is just what Hitler wanted, because he was able to go to the president of Germany, a man by the name of Hindenburg. Hindenburg had been a general in the German army in World War I. He was elderly. He was fading. He didn't have much strength of character by then. He didn't really trust Hitler at this point, but he probably saw Hitler as being the best alternative. Again, given that Germans were still worried that maybe leftists in Germany might rise up, that somehow there might be a communist revolution in Germany because of the Great Depression. So although Hindenburg didn't fully embrace Hitler, Hitler was his best choice. And this is what Hindenburg thinks. And of course, it was stupid and it was horrible and it's going to lead to a complete and utter disaster. But by this point, Hitler had built momentum. The Nazi Party had built momentum. And Hindenburg just was not strong enough to stop it, even if he had really wanted to. and it's very unclear that he really wanted to. So what Hitler, as Chancellor of the Reichstag, he goes to the president of Germany and he persuades Hindenburg to issue an emergency decree where many of the civil liberties in Germany were suspended, including freedom of the press, freedom of expression, the right to hold public assemblies. The police, who more and more are coming under the control, now they're not completely under the control of the Nazis yet, but more and more they are. They're allowed to arrest citizens without cause and put them in jail without cause. And this authority, it goes from state to state. In Germany is made up of a number of different states. Some were more pro-Hitler than others. But over time, Hitler gains control of these individual states in Germany. And Hitler's successful and the Nazis in dismantling Germany's democratic institutions. He does what he and Stalin often do. He begins imprisoning and murdering his chief opponents. When Hindenburg dies in, I think, 1934, Hitler takes on the title of Führer, which roughly translates to leader. He's still chancellor. He becomes commander-in-chief of the army. So when von Hindenburg dies, Hitler consolidates his own power at the head of the German government. Remember Versailles, the Versailles Treaty had limited the size of the German army. Well, Hitler begins his process of tearing up the Versailles Treaty. He starts expanding the army tremendously. He reintroduces the draft in Germany, so young men are eligible for the draft or will be drafted. He also begins to develop a new air force, Luftwaffe, which, if you remember my lecture from yesterday, Versailles had said that Germany couldn't have an air force. Well, Hitler tears up that part of the treaty as well. So he's starting to build up the military. Now, this goes hand in hand with his economic program, because by building up the military, he's putting government money into industry, right, to build up the military. And what does this do? This creates jobs. So what happens is Hitler starts pouring money into the development of a much larger army and air force. And in turn, by doing that, he's creating more jobs for Germans, which helps with the Great Depression. And so it kind of all fits together. The remilitarization of Germany goes a long way to mitigating some of the worst aspects of the Depression, especially unemployment in Germany as well. And Hitler also creates state programs such as the Autobahn, the superhighway in Germany. And I'm sure as many of you know, Dwight Eisenhower, when he saw the Autobahn after World War II, that's how he came up for the idea of the interstate highway system that we have today, I-10, et cetera, et cetera. Again, Hitler's coming in, his discussions about communism, especially the stab in the back theory, his attack against those that are Jewish, is that they're behind the loss at Versailles, that they're making the Great Depression worse, that they're still prospering while the rest of German Aryans are struggling. And there's a surge of German nationalism. A lot of Germans from many aspects of society, not all. Some Germans were horrified, but the majority of Germans, they're really happy about what Hitler's doing. They've been very angry about Versailles. And so when he starts tearing up the Versailles Treaty, that's people in Germany like that. When he comes into power, he reoccupies the Rhineland, which was an area between France and Germany. And the allies, when I say allies in this case, France and England, don't lift a finger to stop him. And this all makes Stalin very, very suspicious. I mean, he's paranoid anyway. But as he looks to France and Germany, and the US is a complete non-factor at this point, the US is not even thinking about Europe. Some people are, but most Americans, it's not on their radar screen at all. When Stalin looks at Hitler's early successes, foreign policy successes, and France and Germany backing down, he's convinced that what France and Germany want is a war between Germany and the Soviet Union. And that's kind of his guiding principle for most of the 1930s. He doesn't trust the capitalist nations. He's convinced that they are out to kill Bolshevism. They had tried to kill it at its birth. And he's convinced that Germany and I'm sorry, England and France are just as happy to have Germany go to war with the Soviet Union. But Stalin is not ready for a war yet. Stalin is still developing his economy, his industrial economy. I think Stalin knew that at some point there'd probably be a war with Hitler, but he's not ready yet. It seems as if Stalin thought that he wouldn't be ready for a war with Hitler until like 1944, 1945, something like that. So all the activities, the foreign policy successes of Hitler make Stalin very, very suspicious of the West, and again, convinced that the West, especially England and France, want a war between Germany and the Soviet Union. And Stalin thinks, well, I'm not going to give them what they want. One last thing about Stalin, also, he forbade the Communist Party in Germany he forbade them to unite with other leftist parties in Germany, especially the socialists in Germany, to create a popular front against Hitler. So in some, unwittingly, Stalin helped Hitler rise because the left, the opposition to Hitler, and there was opposition, especially in the late 20s and early 30s, was never able to coalesce into one voice because one of its strongest elements, the Communist Party, Stalin had said, don't cooperate with any other parties, even if they say they're leftists. You go it alone. And so there's no leftist popular front against Hitler as he comes into power, and then as he starts chipping away at power, or chipping away at folks' rights, individual rights. And Stalin makes Hitler's job easier because of his refusal to let communists in Germany align with other leftist parties into a popular front. Again, this idea that Stalin's stupid until the middle of 1940. And this is one of the dumb things that Stalin does.